it's Dr. Matthew James, President and CEO of Manganese. Manganese is developing a high purity manganese project for the electric vehicle battery industry in the heart of Europe in the Czech Republic.
Brilliant. Good to see you, Matt, and welcome aboard. You're not long on these shores yourself. You kind of came on board in December.
That's correct.
Why don't you start with a little bit about your background, relevant to what you've been asked to do, and then maybe tell us, what problems you've been brought on board to solve.
Sure. Very quickly, my background: material scientist. Went into banking in London, Deutsche Bank for 3 years, 4 years in McKinsey after that in London. And then I went to Australia and got involved in the natural resources industry. And I was 9 years at Linus Corporation, where we developed, the rare earth company, which is now supplying 20% of the world's rare earths from when I joined it, which is a deposit in the ground. And really what I've come into Manganese to do is to take Manganese through that same journey. We have a deposit in the ground, but we now need to secure customer offtake contracts, project financing, which was the main focus of my job at Linus. We are nearing the end of the feasibility study, and the team has done a fantastic job to take it where it is today, identify the deposit, go through the engineering, fantastic work on the ground socially in terms of social engagement. But it now needs to come up to the next level. And so just getting some disciplines around that offtake contract, financing, and then moving into the EPCM strategy and getting that right, getting the right team to execute on the ground in the Czech Republic is really my focus.
Fantastic. Look, I think because we caught up with Marco Romero, crikey, beginning of 2020, beginning of COVID. So his team's kind of brought it to this point, and now you're, again, just that next step change in terms of the delivery of the things that you just mentioned.
That's right. But Marco, I would say Marco is still connected to the company as an advisor, and he's focusing on new projects for us. So, my vision for the company is to make it a multi-asset manganese platform, both in Europe and further abroad.
Right. Okay. But for you guys, in terms of the environment you operate in, manganese, right? I would say it's not that well known within the investing community. So maybe run through, if you don't mind, applications, uses. Clearly, it's feeding into the EV thematic here, but maybe just broad macro for people new to it.
Yeah, it's often called the forgotten metal in the battery. Yeah. But it plays a vital role in the cathode of the battery. Every nickel NMC is nickel, manganese, cobalt, but people talk about manganese last, or if at all. But it's vital, and in the chemistries today, it is it's about 10 to 20% in the cathode. But when you're talking about an industry in Europe or even globally that's going to 5 terawatts of battery capacity, that's a huge amount of manganese. But it's, we're talking about over 900,000 tons of manganese. But what's really critical is it's the high purity manganese. There's plenty of manganese mined, but 99% goes into the steel industry. And that's not sufficiently high purity that's required for the battery industry. So the bottleneck is in the high purity capacity to produce it for the battery industry.
Right. Okay. And in terms of the where this high purity manganese comes from in the world, are there many mines? Are there many producers? I mean, what's the competition like?
No. So there are no primary sources of high purity manganese in Europe or North America today. There is a small producer in Europe that brings ore in from Africa. There's a producer in South Africa that produces metal that's not used in the battery industry. But the vast majority, 90%, comes from China. As with a lot of these critical minerals, our dependency on China is worrying.
Here's the thing. You just come back from a meeting in Europe. You have been meeting up with the Battery Alliance, the European Battery Alliance. they seem to have got their act together, because when we talk on multiple shows that we have on the platform about the European ecosystem and EU taxonomies, and it all feels a little bit disjointed. But this group, the European Battery Alliance, seem to have got their act together and have got people focused in on what it's going to take to actually deliver into these critical mineral lists, which have just sat as an item on the page. Can you tell us a little bit about how they're kind of joining things up, and maybe how you fit in there?
Yeah. So I was in Brussels with a high-level meeting of the European Battery Alliance, and what they've done extremely well in developing the EV battery and EV market in Europe is they've joined together the industry, the key players, the OEMs, the cathode manufacturers in Europe, together with the Vice President of the EU, Maros Sefcovic, who's really been a driver for them. They've asked, and he's delivered on many levels within the EV battery and EV market. Now the focus very much of that whole group, the European Battery Alliance, EIT, the industry, and the EU policymakers, is focused on the raw material side. They've done a very good job in the middle of the supply chain, but they recognise the raw material supplies, particularly with the terrible events that are happening in Europe at the moment. The reliance on whether it's gas or raw materials, Europe needs to be a lot more secure. They already recognise that, but I think this is an added driver. And the focus of the European Battery Alliance is now on both ends of that supply chain. When I say that, that's the raw materials, making sure that the critical projects in Europe are identified and potentially fast-tracked through the permitting processes. And then also the recycling end. That's the other end of the supply chain that they're focused on, making sure that the batteries are being recycled and fed back into the EV market themselves.
Right. Okay. Now we're getting into the rub of it. Can you maybe just share some of the numbers around the high purity coming? You've told us maybe where the players are and the fact that it's hard to get hold of, and not a lot of operators or players in the European system. So if the EU is to deliver what it says, which is its own EV ecosystem, how's pricing affecting how's price affecting your ability to deliver this program? Do you need to see it go up more? Because it's had a nice sort of uplift recently, but are you able to produce economically at current levels, or do you need incentives, grants, etc., and from the EU?
It's a very good question. So by 2030, the EU needs about 250,000 tonnes of high purity manganese. Our project will produce 50,000 tonnes. So we will only be able to supply at that time sort of 20% of the market. So there are other projects in the pipeline, but I think we're a good couple of years ahead of others. In terms of pricing, there's only one benchmark price for high purity manganese, and that's X-Works China, and it's what's known as Class 1. And that it's the impurities which are important in high purity manganese, and the impurities in the Chinese Class 1 material don't meet the specifications required by the European cathode manufacturers. We've seen those specs, we can compare them, and our process is designed to meet that higher specification. So immediately there's an extra cost for producing a higher purity material. Then also we're in Europe, we're not in China, and that's a higher cost base. I think everyone recognises, power prices, labour prices, and also the environmental emissions and limits are tighter in Europe. So that adds an extra cost as well. So when we're in discussions with the customers, there's a recognition that, looking at the index price in ex-works China for this lower purity material versus what we're supplying just from a purity and cost perspective, there needs to be a differential between that. And then you add on top of that, well, we will be the only secure, traceable, ECG compliant green material available in Europe, and there's a premium for that as well. So we are using the benchmark as a basis, but then applying those cost differentials and premium on top of that for our pricing discussions.
Right. I guess the bit that interests me is, where does that premium come from? Because if the customers recognize it and will pay for it because there's a shortage, they can't get it elsewhere, that's one thing. That's in a contract. If it's coming from politicians, from governments, that can go as quickly as it comes, because as they flip onto the next new thing. So where's that premium going to come from? What does that look like? Are they going to be tax breaks? Are they going to be grants or other types of incentives? In terms of your build out process.
Yeah. So we do have the Czech government is very supportive. We have a tax break from them for a number of years as an incentive. The way it's going to come from is there's a term called the battery passport, and basically this is likely to be legislation or maybe even a sort of brand, an accreditation, I think is probably a better word for it, that batteries that are made or supplied into Europe have to meet a set of criteria around ESG, and they'll be accredited or they won't be accredited, and if they're not accredited, then they're likely to have a import duty or penalty applied to them, and that is going to be a leveling up of the playing field from a battery perspective. Now, when we're in our ESG compliance, we just had the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development invest $8.5 million. That's a huge tick for us from an ESG perspective, because they have very best-in-class standards that they require for a investment into a company, that they meet their ESG standards. So I'm confident that any battery maker that uses our manganese, and they're obviously going to have to do the same with the nickel and the other materials, will be able to meet that accreditation. And we're designing our ESG program just at the moment, our systems and targets around the 27 ESG elements that have been identified by the Battery Alliance for that battery passport.
Oh, that's interesting, because we talk about the ESG a lot, and companies come and tell us about that they're doing a lot at local level for whether it be First Nations or drilling water wells, or engaging properly with the locals more broadly. What they don't say is, here's a list of things that we are obliged to tick off and meet. That is an industry-wide agreed protocol, as it were. So who's put that together?
So that's the Global Battery Alliance, which has come out of the World Economic Forum. But they're working with the European Battery Alliance, and they're just starting out on this journey, but they have now put together their list of 27 indicators in the ESG framework. Even things like, obviously we don't have to deal with it, but child labour in some of the battery materials, that is an issue, and But CO2 footprint is obviously a very key one as well. But right across the ESG spectrum, they've identified these indicators that they're going to be measuring the producers on for the batteries.
Okay. I just think it's interesting that people, because most companies are waiting around, not quite knowing. They've got their own version of what ESG means, right? So, and I think if there's a uniform protocol, then you can compare companies more readily. So I think that's really interesting indeed. But just coming back to the money side of things, because I just think it's really important for people to understand what the playing field. So you're saying there's potential for like bifurcated market in terms of pricing, which will be leveled up with either taxes or other kind of tools available to governments in terms of penalizing or incentivizing companies, whether they be inside or outside of the EU. It gets a bit messy eventually because you need to find there'll be a point at which there's a massive delta between the supply and the demand. And do you think standards will slip?
Well, I think that's. I think we can talk about these premiums, but the underlying macro level is, like you say, there is a huge deficit in this material growing. We use a consultancy that provides independent data to us, and even if they add in all this supply that's potentially in the pipeline, plus they add another huge wodge that could come out of China, there's still a 400,000 ton per annum gap in 2030. So that benchmark that we talked about, we believe, and they believe, they're putting out price projections. That underlying benchmark is going to increase in price over the long term as well. So the underlying benchmark is going to increase in price. Plus, there will be this bifurcated market, like you say. Europe is not going to be able to supply all its needs. It's going to have to buy from other places. We've just seen VW do a nickel and cobalt deal in China. What they're going to have to do is make sure those suppliers meet the criteria that are being set, so that they can bring their cathode materials into their gigafactories in Europe and meet the required standards. So it's going to be up to the industry to make sure that their supply sources are meeting these requirements. And if they're not, then the question is, how is it going to be policed, if you like, or credited? And yes, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but
I think we spoke to a few companies in terms of tracking. All of the components in a supply chain, so you can test whether it has been ethically sourced or what's happening within.
It comes down to that traceability.
Yeah,
and really understanding if you're outside of Europe, and it's easy for us inside of Europe to prove the traceability. They can come and see the mine, etc. If you're outside of Europe, making sure that there's a system of traceability back to exactly where that material came from, and then that material is compliant. But going back to one of your earlier questions is, okay, well, how does this price affect your economics? So with that underlying increase for price forecast and the premium that we're going to get in Europe, the project economics should be very strong. Our PEA was very positive, and we're just about to finish our DFS. And I think we're going to see cost increases. That's happened across the ballpark, but I still feel that the project economics will be even stronger than the PEA going forward. But I can't give you any numbers until we've actually finished that work.
Okay.
Where we're at is just compiling all of our final costs.
Right. I was about to say, because every company I speak to, costs are going up, whether it be reagents or energy prices or fuel prices. labour, delays to the start of projects. It's getting tough out there across the board. I think that's well understood. Can I just talk about the EU then, because we're kind of bouncing around, this EU, infrastructure was being put together, and driven in part by the European Battery Alliance. But you're in Czechoslovakia. You're going through the study phase.
Czech Republic.
I say the Czech Republic. Ooh, yes. Blast of the past. Czech Republic. Right smack in the middle of Europe. How much help are you getting from the Czech government? Because we've seen cases across Europe where projects are being stopped or blocked, whether it be by local level, local government level, or federally. How truly joined up is this? I mean, I suspect I'm talking probably about mining, and you're obviously about dealing with tailings, recovery, remediation, and rehabilitation. So perhaps yours is a different case. But what are you seeing in terms of the response from the Czech government?
Yeah, so I think you're right. There are multiple levels there. Let's start at the local level. We are, as you say, remediating a currently polluting site from an old pyrite mine that was closed in the 1970s. And as we process material, we'll be putting modern tailings management standards in and stopping that pollution once we process all the tailings. The local government recently just approved that we have 2 local communities. The Černovice municipality has just approved a land access deal through a rental mechanism. So we can now access their part of the land, which we need to do to get that land access. And they've been very supportive, and we've got very good relationships. The other local community is the Trnavka community. They've just approved rezoning of their part of the deposit into a mining lease. So that just demonstrates the local community support for the project. We are working hand in hand with the local governments, even to the extent where they're advertising the jobs that we're creating on their websites, because we're recruiting now for our demonstration plant. We're also, good communication at the provincial level for that Paradise area. And then at the federal level, we have very good support from the government. As I mentioned before, the tax break. They are also using, they talk about our project. There was a meeting of trade ministers in Europe, and the Czech trade minister uses our project as an example of what the Czech Republic is contributing to the EV battery supply chain. So it's very visible, both at the European and the Czech government level. We're very visible in the local community. We're communicating with them on a regular basis. We send out newsletters to 2,000 households in the region just to communicate exactly where we're at. And we have also an open office day every week where people can come and talk to us about the project.
Okay, so, and which is great. That sounds great on a local level. What's with regards to the kind of process? You talk about doing PFS at the moment, but you're also going to be commencing, permitting, etc. And in the context of what you said earlier with the discussions in Germany with the European Battery Alliance and everyone involved with it, priority projects, getting projects through the process quicker. Is the Czech government on board with that, or is that?
That was only discussed last week, right? So it has to be a process put in place and communications, from the European Battery Alliance and the EU.
Right.
I think what's really important is, when we talk about fast tracking, we're not talking about cutting any corners. The standards are the standards, and they have to be absolute. But the ability to maybe parallel process some of these approval processes is really what would enable these projects to get off the ground quicker, and they needed to get off the ground, quicker, and not not get bogged down in permitting processes.
Right. Okay. Because time's money, etc. And it'd be great to see some sort of joined up thinking from the politicians across Europe and obviously in the Czech Republic too. So permitting process. So where are you with those bits and pieces that you need? You've got everything that you need at the moment. You're not sitting waiting for anything, are you?
No. So we did our preliminary environmental permit. That was approved in 2020. That's been fed into, there wasn't any material issues, but what the comments that did come back have been fed into our process. We froze the process earlier this year. We needed to do that to be able to then go out for the RFQs, etc., for the equipment. And now we've frozen that process. We're putting together the final environmental and social impact assessment. That will be submitted in the middle of this year. And on current timelines, that's a 6 to 9 month approval timeframe. So we're talking early 2023. And then on the current process, we then apply for our land permit and construction permit. And that could be another 6 months. So middle of 2023 on the current sort of permitting timescales, that's where we're looking for our construction permit. And then in parallel with that is putting in the offtake contracts through 2022 to underpin the bank financing, and then put that bank financing in place late 2022 to the middle of 2023, so it aligns with that construction permit timeframe.
Okay, and just on the money front, the EBRD, European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, just put in 8.5 million as a strategic investment. What was that to help you do? Is it specifically targeted at something, or was it more broad investment?
It's specifically earmarked at the demonstration plant and the additional work through the development of the site in the Czech Republic. So it's all being spent in the Czech Republic. But crucially, it gave us just that extra bit of financing that means we're fully financed through to that final investment decision. All being well in terms of hitting those timeframes. At the end of last year, we had $30 million in the bank, plus now the $8.5 million. It means we have just under $40 million in the bank, and that should take us through to final investment decision. So we don't have to go back out to the equity market for another raising. And that message is really important for the investment community, to understand there should be no further dilution from an equity perspective through to final investment decision next year.
Okay, yeah, it feels like it's moving forward. What about some of the technical partners, like the EIT, Energy guys, Nano One, people like that? Are they all moving forward, or are you're still friends?
Yeah. So the EIT they are shareholders with us.
Yeah.
EIT Energy, their role is not really a technical one. It is more facilitating communication with the off-takers and potentially, the EIB, people like that. They were fundamental in the introduction to EBRD and getting the EBRD investment. Nano One, we are working with Nano One. Nano One is a company that's developing sort of a next generation metal direct to cathode scheme process. That it's really as I'm learning more about this industry, the cathode manufacturers have a real issue, and you heard Elon Musk talk about it actually, that they bring in all these sulfides for their cathode production. They then have a big sodium sulfate issue to deal with in terms of disposal. They can mix it with phosphate to go into the fertilizer industry, but a lot of processes at the moment just dispose of it into the sea or to the waterways, which we don't think is going to be sustainable long term. So this metal to cathode process is quite exciting. It will remove that pollution issue from the cathode step, and we are working with Nano One on that. And we actually very hopeful about getting a Canadian government grant to help fund our part of that work in supplying metal powders to Nano One.
Interesting.
And developing a large scale commercial process for that.
Yeah, we spoke to them last year, so I thought it was a very, very interesting company and CEO, quite frankly. Okay, well, look, Matt, should we wrap it up there, because I think that's a nice sort of overview of how things are progressing, and you've helped us with a little bit of understanding about the market, not just for manganese, but in terms of the battery market in Europe. So look, I appreciate your time. Stay in touch as things progress. We'd be delighted to have you back on.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity.